Right, there's really no beating around the bush on this one. I hated Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, and here are all the reasons why. My name is Rebecca, this is Oz and Elsewhere, and I have a very important problem to address within the reading community. Have you ever read a book that you hated so much that you only finished it because you had the thought of the negative review you were about to write in your head the entire time? Have you ever hated a book so much you couldn't wait to see other people's negative reviews, and then you checked and it's apparently widely lauded and has also been awarded? Because that was my experience with Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. Reading reviews of Prophet Song, which I actually started doing before I finished the book even, because I needed to find out that I wasn't alone. I did find some negative reviews, and the thing that people seem to mention the most is the language. It was one of the most common critiques, because Prophet Song is written in this very modern, postmodernist, some would say broadernist language. It's very confusing and alliterative with long run-on sentences, no paragraph breaks, not some breaks in conventional punctuation, and some people find that difficult to read. I actually didn't mind the language that much. However, I found that because other elements of the novel didn't work, that then the language didn't work as much for me. And there were a few quibbles that I had with the language, even though they were relatively minor compared to everything else that I hated in this book. I think it impedes what Paul Lynch is trying to do. So he was trying to write this psychological perspective on a dystopia, which is kind of the excuse given for why the society isn't as well developed, because it's more about one person's reaction to the society. However, then the language creates a veil between the reader and the character, where okay, this is supposed to be a psychological book, but I don't really feel close to the character's psychology because it's so convoluted. And it winds up flattening the emotion, because then every single emotion is conveyed in the same way. It winds up a very similar tone winds up taking place, for example, when the character loses her job and when she figures out her husband is like missing. And I don't think that necessarily works for a psychological novel. And since the novel itself already suffers from bad pacing and a kind of a lack of dynamism, the language winds up flattening any potential dynamism even further. So it has the same tone, pretty much the same tone throughout. At the beginning, in the middle, like when Eilish gets a head injury, I could barely tell, because the narration and her inner monologue is pretty much the same as before she got the head injury. And that winds up killing the emotion in important moments that were supposed to be emotional. It winds up making for a kind of boring read, and it kills the effect that I think Lynch was trying to go for, which is that of kind of the frog in boiling water, of the slow collapse of society, but when you're in it, you don't realize, because it doesn't work for a few reasons, but one of those is that the language is so flat throughout that it's the same at the beginning when, they're haven't fully realized what's going on, and it's the same at the end when they're like living in a pretty much civil war zone. And that just kills, I think, the momentum that was trying to be achieved. And why do I think that the language is part of the problem, even though it wasn't my biggest issue with the book, is because the few times that it stops is when the book becomes more effective. So when Eilish finds Bailey's body, that's when Lynch changes his narration style, and the emotional weight of the moment is so much heavier. And I think had there been some dynamism in the narration, had there been some changes in the style, in the narration style, had this emotion been allowed to shine through at other moments of the book, it would have been more effective. So to conclude my review of the kind of language used and the narration style, I don't find it as much of a problem as other readers. But I think that because there are other problems with the book that then exacerbates the inadequacies of the language, it then falls flat. My biggest issue with this book and was the way that the society was set up, or rather not set up. It's just there. The main conceit of this book is apparently, what if stuff that happened to brown people happens to white people? And I'm not pulling this out of thin air here. Lynch has said in interviews that he was inspired by the Syrian civil war and subsequent refugee crisis, and he wanted to write a book where stuff that he saw happening to refugees was happening to an Irish family, with the goal of changing people's minds about what refugees are going through. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he said this in a few interviews. And don't get me wrong, this is a great goal. This is a noble goal. And if Paul Lynch has succeeded in changing even one person's mind, getting them to read Prophet Song and being like, okay, wow, I actually get it now. I'm not going to fall for all the fear mongering from the Daily Mail and whatnot. That is amazing and wonderful, and hats off to him. And I'm going to set aside my own personal quibbles of why can't someone just be empathetic with people no matter what race they are, because I know what world we live in, unfortunately, and sometimes this is necessary. That does not make for a good literary work, though. Then that makes for a work that should be shelved with Robin DiAngelo, not other Booker Prize winners, in my opinion. Especially because the way that Lynch did this is not just poorly written, it's also sometimes comes off as factually inaccurate, or at the very least factually lazy. So he just creates a world that's a pretty much hodgepodge of totalitarian, authoritarian, and repressive societies worldwide. So, and it just kind of feels like he's sprinkling stuff in, like, here's a detail from a documentary I watched on the siege of Sarajevo. Here's some stuff I learned about Syria. Yeah, there's some random rescuers in white helmets here. Where'd they come from? Nobody goes. Where did they come from? Where did they go? Here's some stuff I read about in the Latin American Dirty War. And, like, let's just all match these together and mention them. And it's jarring, I guess, when you're familiar with the real life equivalent to this, to be like, wait, why is this here? Like, why is this also here? It really comes off as just a hodgepodge, and also comes off as historically lazy. Let's take the Latin American dirty wars, or the military dictatorships in, for example, Argentina and Chile of the mid to late 20th centuries. All of these events that Lynch is referencing have very real historical reasons for why they occurred. For example, CIA intervention in Latin America to prevent the potential rise of left-wing or socialist politicians in what the United States perceived as its own backyard. Again, I'm paraphrasing. And then to just plop these events in relatively contemporary Ireland reads as kind of lazy and kind of confusing. Like, why is this now happening? Again, Lynch doesn't have to do a whole political chronology, but he doesn't, like, just taking obvious real world references and just dropping them into Ireland, especially Ireland that's otherwise very similar to, I think, what Ireland is now. It's obviously a contemporary set novel, characters with smartphones and social media. It's jarring, and especially, and this is my biggest issue, that just transferring stuff that is now happening to non-white people to white people doesn't work, because there is a reason that these non-white people are being treated this way, and it's because of racism. Like, it's something that an Irish character in 21st century Europe probably would not experience. And nowhere is this more jarring than in the last chapter, when Eilish finally gets off her ass and her family are refugees, where Lynch references kind of holding camps and transit camps and evil border guards. And he's like, I've worked in migration policy, and I know that he's referencing real things that are happening, but they are happening to Middle Eastern and African and South Asian refugees. It would not happen to a white person. And okay, this book was written before the war in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, because the war in Ukraine has been going on since 2014. But there's a very real example. I mean, Ukrainian refugees are treated differently. I'm not going to say better, because I don't think there's any better when like your home is actively being bombed and Ukrainians are still discriminated against in Europe, but they are treated differently from the way brown refugees from other places are. So then I think that just making Eilish go through the same thing that, let's say, an Afghan mother of four arriving on the Aegean coast of Greece would go through, it wouldn't work. It just wouldn't happen that way. Unless this world Lynch is building is a world that has the European Union, but somehow instantly regressed racial attitudes towards Irish people from 150 years ago. Maybe that's what's happening. But that's why I think just what if what happened to brown people happened to white people doesn't work, because it wouldn't happen. Not in this world. And again, if this is just an exercise in racial empathy, sure. But if it has literary aspirations, then you should be trying to say something true. And the most infuriating thing for me is when at the end of the book, they get smuggled out and they're getting on these boats. Because again, it's clear that he thought he was doing something great with that. It's clear that this is something he saw in the headlines, was like, you know what? I see people aren't empathetic towards refugees in small boats. Let me put my refugee family in a small boat. But this doesn't make any sense if you think about it for more than 30 seconds, which is clear that the Booker judges didn't, I guess. Because, first of all, he's saying the rationale for why they have to be smuggled is that, you're going to be in the camps for months and months and months and months, and they're not going to do anything. You're just going to be stuck there. But how would they know that? Because has anyone been there for months and months yet? There's no, first of all, the timeline in the book is all messed up, but how would you know? Or unless Eilish has been an even more ignorant mother and just hasn't realized that this crisis has been going on for over a year at this point. And also, they are getting on a boat in Northern Ireland because the legal system after they cross the border from the Republic into the north of Ireland is restrictive towards refugees. And then they are crossing the channel, or whatever, I forget the name of the body of water, I'm so mad, presumably to Scotland, which is also in the United Kingdom. It's in the same country with the same legal system. So why are they getting in a boat, a very dangerous boat, to get away from this bad legal system that's unfair to refugees to go to the same country? And that's why I think that just what if stuff that happened to brown people happened to white people doesn't work, because then it just becomes absurd. I think the lack of specificity and the lack of detail actually makes the "it could happen here" less realistic, because it's such a drastic change from what even I know of contemporary Ireland that I spend the whole time going, okay, well, how could this happen? If things happen for a reason, how could this happen? And the vagueness weirdly winds up also making it less relatable. You can tell that Lynch is trying to make this avoid any possible caveats, avoid making his book dated by making any specific claims. And that winds up making it more ridiculous. So say, for example, this bit. So the media is restricted, and there is one narrative, but what's happening is in the other narrative. So the characters are using the internet to find out what's really happening. But it's clear that Lynch didn't want to reference a specific social media platform because dynamics change all the time. Say, for example, he said Twitter isn't named Twitter anymore. And it's also gotten completely irrelevant to global events because of thank you, Elon Musk. But his solution to this is to just have characters constantly be like, oh, I saw this on social media. This is what they're saying on social media. Here, they're spreading this on social media. People don't talk like that. I've never gone up to my partner and be like, here, this is on social media. I'll say, oh, I saw this here, here, here. Or I'll say it sometimes, but not all the time. I'll reference specific platforms, channels. And weirdly, it also winds up dating it even more because a lot of contemporary, I'm talking like this year, 2025, 2026, political upheavals are not necessarily diffused, coordinated through social media because of the changes in the way social media platforms are used and algorithmic changes. It relies on a lot of closed channels. So, for example, Discord servers in Nepal or Telegram channels or WhatsApp groups. And then even he's trying so hard to be universal and it still doesn't work. It's still dated. And I think that's the one of the big issues. So he wants to tell a universal story rather than telling the story that he sat down to write. And that's a shame because the few times that he includes more specific details, such as Eilish going to the wedding where the groom stands up and does this super nationalist thing, it actually feels more grounded. It feels more realistic. It feels like, okay, this is what is happening. And then the rest is just vague, like, oh, it's bad now. There are secret police. How? I don't know. What are they investigating? We don't know. The last big issue I have with the way the society is run is that even the few details that Lynch does include, they don't make sense. They are inaccurate. So for example, the order in which services disappear. Like how do they have hot water for so long? How do they have running water for so long? And certain things that are characteristic of failing societies doesn't mention. For example, a huge problem usually is the reliability of salary payments and pension payments, but that's not mentioned at all in the book. And at first I thought this was just my vague gut feeling, but then I read this mentioned in a lot of other reviews, especially reviews from people who either themselves or their families have gone through things like this. And that's when I realized, okay, this makes sense because although I was born in New York in 1997, my family is from the former Yugoslavia, Croatia specifically. So my family has gone through this kind of societal collapse, although in a very different way from what Lynch is portraying. So then I know from their stories, and I know also from seeing the reactions my family still has in this aftermath, that a lot of the things that Lynch describes, they don't really line up with their experience. And that was a universal as I was kind of reading reviews. A lot of the negative reviews I was reading were from people from, say, post-communist countries such as Bulgaria or Czechoslovakia that have memories of the secret police at the time, people who've gone through military dictatorships, a lot of negative reviews if you look at the Greek language edition of Prophet Song. And a lot of people from Latin America saying like, okay, this doesn't necessarily line up with my experience. And it seems as if Lynch was writing just for an audience of people for whom this kind of thing is completely unimaginable because it has never happened to them. And if anything similar has happened to you or anyone in your family, then this book is not for you. My third major problem with this book, as what made for an infuriating read, is Eilish Stack, bad decision maker extraordinaire. Isn't just like my personal frustration with a flawed character. Like I can read flawed characters, I'm fine, I'm an adult. I think her character is inconsistent and it is an example of bad craft. The first issue I have with Eilish as a character is that she is the wrong stand-in for the type of story that Lynch is trying to tell. So it's clear that Lynch wants to create a story where people are empathetic towards refugees by creating a character who will not just be relatable, but who's going to be perfect. So, and like, she has to be so close to the educated public. So she has to be like a mother, not just a mother of one, she's going to be a mother of four. She has to be she's highly educated. Her husband is highly educated. She is upper middle class because, I'm sorry, but who else can afford to go on a, like, they're going on a family vacation to Canada, all six of them. Like, okay, even if they're staying for free with the sister, you have to have money for the airfare. And her sister, she has a sister in Canada. Her sister's also upper middle class, clearly has money. And so he wants to make her perfect to show that this can happen to anyone else. But the thing is, that makes her a bad stand-in because she is so unrepresentative of the average refugee that the predicament she finds herself in is are highly ridiculous. And it's clear that he has to put the thumb on the scale of the plot to make them happen to a character like this. And this reminds me of what Leon Krause, a Mexican journalist, wrote in his critique of American Dirt, and I hate, like, I should not be making an American Dirt comparison with a Booker winner, where he said that Janine Cummins did the same thing of like trying to make this character that would be super relatable to American readers and make them be like, wow, immigrants are good. But then made her a character that was absolutely not being, very rarely be in the situation that she was in, is absolutely unrepresentative of the average immigrant. And honestly, this comes across as offensive a few times. Eilish, again, the audience mouthpiece, the Lynch mouthpiece, says, history is a silent record of people who could not leave. It is a record of those who did not have a choice. You cannot leave when you have nowhere to go and have not the means to go there. You cannot leave when your children cannot get a passport, cannot go when your feet are rooted in the earth, and to leave means tearing off your feet. However, like, half of this quote doesn't apply to Eilish. She has somewhere to go. She has a sister that's been begging her to go there. She has the means to go there. She is wealthy, or at the very least upper middle class, with a wealthy relative. Even the second part of the quote is later completely undone because, surprise, surprise, there's a smuggler that can help them overcome the lack of a passport for the baby, and her older son is fucked off anyway. So, like, why is she saying this quote when this is not true? This is not true, and it is offensive to people who are literally experiencing this, to put this quote in the mouthpiece of someone who is not having this experience. And that is what is infuriating about Eilish, among many other things. What I have with Eilish is that her lack of knowledge of the political situation is so laughable that it's only possible if Paul Lynch puts his thumb on the scale of the plot, because he needs this to happen. So again, there's lots of people that defended this book saying, oh, well, there's lots of stories of people in World War II who could have left Germany and then decided not to because they thought it would get better. But Eilish is a character as historical foresight. She's also not someone who's politically ignorant. She is married to a husband who is politically active. And it makes no sense that neither of them took any precautions, not even for emigration, but any precautions whatsoever to protect their children if he is going to continue his politically sensitive job. Because I don't think any contemporary trade unionist, I would love to meet the person if this is true, and I think few contemporary trade unionists sit there and be like, who they're not gonna touch when the dictatorship comes into power? The trade unionists. And they're also clearly aware that their society is going down a bad path. The YouTuber, the Disco King, who is one of the few other people I've noticed that share my opinions of this book, mentions the very, very strained exposition at the beginning where they reference like, oh, this has been going on for months. This is the bad things. So they know there is a problem. And neither Eilish nor her husband Larry do anything. The other reason, and finally, I find it really hard to read Eilish because Eilish's perspective is that of a bad mother who keeps endangering her children. This is not just her refusing to leave, even though I have thoughts about that. She doesn't do anything to protect her children. She doesn't stock up in supplies. She doesn't get water. So her child, there's bad water coming out of the tap, and it does not occur to her like, oh yeah, we should probably get bottled water. So then when weeks later the water completely goes off, they don't have water. And this is not addressed at all. Like, sometime later they reference a water truck coming to the neighborhood. But what her family does in between the time dumb Eilish forgot to get water for her children and the water truck shows up, is not mentioned. Someone would probably be dehydrated by then. When shooting starts, she decides to go to an ATM, even though the ATM is obviously closed. And even minor things, when she takes her dad to the hospital, for a memory assessment, because she suspects that he has dementia, in fact, very clearly has dementia, she leaves her baby alone with her dad so she can go to the coffee machine. And of course her dad wanders off and leaves the baby alone. I don't know, man. I've never had a baby, but I don't plan on leaving him alone with dementia patients anytime soon. It's just these minor details that are okay, this woman doesn't know how to care for her kids. Honestly, the biggest problem with Eilish as a parent is the fact that she doesn't leave even though, unlike the typical refugee, has multiple opportunities to do so. It does not even occur to her as an option. So Carol has to be the one to tell her, hey, your son got a mandatory military call-up. Maybe he should leave the country. And Eilish is the one that's like, no, I think he should finish school. Like, if he leaves the country, that'll impact his schooling. You know what else is going to impact his schooling? Mandatory military service and getting his head blown up. Like, and then when she gets a golden opportunity to leave, completely paid for by her sister, she's like, "Oh, I'm not leaving because it's bad for a dementia patient to move them away from their memories." You know what also exacerbates dementia? Living in a war zone. And there is a scene that is so infuriating to read where Molly is actively begging her to leave. Molly is saying that she is she feels unsafe, she wants to leave, she is in danger, and Eilish just tells her, "Well, who will take care of your grandfather?" I don't know, like that just is such an awful thing to say to a child. I mean, there are obviously that is an agonizing decision to make. Do you take care of your parent, your only living parent? Do you, or do you put your children, but to outright tell your child, I am putting my dad before you. Grandpa is more important to me than you, is an awful, awful thing to do. And that just does not get addressed by the narrative at all, I think. Now, Eilish doesn't have to be perfect. Actually, I think this could have been an interesting book about a character who is normally smart and competent, who is then completely not up to the task of what is happening and dealing with this collapse, and who winds up failing as a parent, winds up parentifying her older daughter. But that's the book that I that's the events that I got. That is not what the book told. The book kept emphasizing that, oh, this is about, look at what she's trying to do for her family and she's doing nothing. Look at the difficult choices and she's not making choices. It's just like inertia is happening. And that's, I think, my biggest issue, is that there is such a disconnect between what the book is telling me is happening and what like my eyes are reading. And to some extent that's the fault of the jacket copy, which built it up as, I can't remember the exact language, but it's like, what would one woman do for her family? Like, what does she decide to leave it all behind? And that's not what's happening. But this constant like pressing again, this constant telling us like, no, like this is Eilish, she is a great mom, she's a mom, super mom, and she's putting her kids first, and she is trying to do the best that she can. And you're reading about this character who just keeps making mistake after mistake. And there's also like, again, pressing the thumb on the scale to try and make this decision happen, and pressing the thumb on the scale to then vindicate Eilish within the narrative. There's this ridiculous conversation that she has with this couple when they're finally in the refugee camp, and they're like, "Oh no, we also didn't leave on time. It's okay. It's totally okay that you didn't." That just felt so ridiculous to me. Like, this is clearly Lynch knowing that readers would have a negative reaction to this, and then just be like, "See, but these people also didn't, so like it's okay that Eilish didn't," even though that literally and then at the same time punishing her within the narrative for losing Bailey. And I don't know, that was my biggest problem, is that the book is telling me one thing but actually doing something completely else. And I think it doesn't know what it's trying to do. It doesn't know if it's going to be didactic, like teaching people empathy. It doesn't know if it's going to be literary. It doesn't know if it's going to be about this like difficult choice. It doesn't know if it's going to be about this woman unraveling. There are a lot of smaller problems, such as kids not actually seeing like kids, scientists never acting like a scientist, continuity errors like Carol just straight up disappearing and nobody seemingly caring about this, why this woman who's been hanging around their house all the time is just gone. The fact that the whole book has been building up to the narrative of what them deciding to leave or not, and then when they do decide to leave, it just time jumps to them being on a bus. We don't know how they got on the bus, where they're going on the bus, or why they got on the bus. But this is my biggest issue, the disconnect between what it is telling you, that it is beating you over the head with what it wants to say, and what it is actually saying. Would love to know your thoughts, especially if other people dislike this book. And I really hope that the rest of my reading in 2026 and the rest of my reviews are going to be a lot more positive than what I just put out.